book is that the main thing about envy is about vanity, is about I cannot admit that I am not so big as you. I mean, there is, but that's his conclusion. You read the book and you can have other conclusions. I think it's a kind of an open thing that I try to leave it in the end. Do you feel envy? In which situations? What are the consequences of this? And the consequences for others and the consequences for yourself. All this is discussed in a way in this book by the different characters that appear here.
David, curious, how did the translation process happen? Did Ricardo approach you? Carlos approached you? How close did you work with the author?
I would like to thank, first of all, I came across this novel 2-3 years ago, when shortly after it came out, and I would like to thank Rogério Beltrão Coelho, who I think he passed through Bristol one summer and left me some books and left me this book. And of course I was familiar with the name, Carlos Morais José. I'd read a previous work by him. And I read it and was fascinated by the novel. I think it's a novel that can be read on really many layers and does things to you as you read it and translate it. Although Carlos had to live with this character and created this character and lived with it for much longer than I did. Then I actually gave a paper on it at our annual academic conference in England in relation to another Anglophone novel, and I don't give so many of these papers now. It was Brian Castro's The Bath Fugues, and it's about forgery and appropriation, and I began to wonder, well, as a translator, am I an appropriator? Am I a forger? So that kind of interested me. And then as I've retired, I don't go to so many academic conferences now. I prefer festivals like these that are open to the general public and are less formal. So it was put aside, and then last autumn, it must have been, I suppose, I get an email from Ricardo saying, how would you like to translate this novel? And I said, well, yes, I'd love to, count me in. And he said, there's only one problem, I want it ready for the literary festival in March. So it was a hectic, I mean, I've never translated a novel so quickly, because in publishers in the UK or the US, it's, you do it over a year, and then you wait for a year whilst it's processed, the copy editing, etc. And then eventually it comes out. So this was in express style, and I delivered the novel. Once I hit my rhythm, it progressed quite easily, and there were one or two points that I consulted Carlos on. I got his email, and he very graciously, responded to the queries I had over the meaning of a word or the particular nuance of a word, I should say. And I delivered it. And then, of course, I was, because I'm used to the kind of very slow, ponderous way that American publishers with which I've worked recently operate, I was concerned that it wouldn't be out in time. So there I was pestering poor old Ricardo with emails, is it going to be ready? Are the proofs ready? And sure enough, it was in this lovely edition. So I would like to thank Ricardo. I would like to thank Carlos, of course, for agreeing that I should translate it, and would like to thank Ricardo for all the hard work and rigor that he put in producing this beautiful edition. And it showed me one thing, that this combination of produced in Macau, of course, a combination of Portuguese laid-backness and Chinese industry and efficiency is a potent cocktail. I think you're the future of the world. I think the future of the world is in Macau, actually. So that's how the novel came about. The challenges were, I suppose, typical of a translator: how to convey the different voices that are contained in this very rich novel. I was going to read a passage. I don't know whether you would like it. Yes, yeah.
David,
just
let me before that to give an example of our communication, because you might think, especially the people from Asia, might think that European languages are more or less very close, but there's the cultural part which is not sometimes so close. And one of the great examples of this was that this part of the book where I write about fire, and I say the fire of this, the fire of that, and suddenly I say the fire of the bells. And David asked me, the bells? Do the bells have fire? I mean, what I mean the bells? But when I write in Portuguese, for a Portuguese person, I will write o fogo dos sinos. Sinos from, immediately we're talking about the church, and we're talking about fire. When there is a fire in the villages, the bells ring. And this is very typical of Portugal, although it's not typical of England, for instance. So for a Portuguese reader, it would be obvious that when I write the fire of bells, he will know immediately, but David had to explain a little bit more. The fire of the church bells, And this was an example of how difficult, and how I'm so grateful to David for his very careful translation, that when he have a doubt, he really consulted me, and so the result is amazing. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, really.
Thank you for
don't thank me, because I'm really grateful to you.
For
this amazing work.
But you sent me to Google, in fact, church and the role of church bells in kind of Elizabethan England. And I think the bell did toll. Church bells were used to convey news, not necessarily of a fire, perhaps. I don't know.
That's in Elizabeth in England. I'm talking about now in Portugal.
Right.
That was my infant experience when I go to the countryside where my parents are, and normally in the summer, there is a fire always. So we wake up in the middle of the night, and it's a crazy moment in the village, because everybody gets out of bed and goes to the main square, and then they go to try to put out the fire. Some of them, mainly boys and girls, they go, they have this chance to get out of the world and maybe do something else. They don't, because everybody's so distracted with the fire and so excited that, okay, sometimes some marriages happen there. It's a great moment, It's a terrible moment. At the same time, it's a very emotionally charged moment. This fire in the, it's a kind of apocalyptic thing. So that influenced my imaginary as a child, and it came out.
Right, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
okay.
No. Will the church bells toll every time Theresa May goes off to Brussels? You want me to read a passage? I'm not going to give anything away, but Glenn and Carlos have said as much, that there is the encounter in Singapore between...
what intrigues me about that is because Carlos is writing in Portuguese, where I presume he creates the voice of the pompous Englishman, which in Portuguese, which you then translate into English for the pompous Englishman.
Yes. Well, I suppose it was my prejudice against this Englishman in a sense. But he was pompous. Yes, he was rather self-assured, wasn't he? I think, and I particularly like. I developed a soft spot for the Irishman, actually. Are there any Irish in the audience? Because I'm going to do an Irish accent, and there's nothing that the Irish hate more than a Brit doing an Irish accent. No. Well, I'm going to read you a little bit, and you'll get a flavour of the book, and hopefully it will encourage you then to go and buy it. A certain disdain for this Irishman began to bubble up on the outer limits of my Christian charity. The snivelling, ruddy-faced creature repelled me, and it was only with great difficulty that I managed to put up with his garrulousness, seasoned with a putrid breath. The fellow certainly realized how much he disgusted me, for he stepped back to distance himself a little, given that his foul smell was making life insufferable for any civilized person. He seemed genuinely offended as he realized the extent of the contempt that I openly displayed towards him, and once again he stood more firmly before addressing me in a low voice. You, good sir, cannot imagine what knowledge a poor unfortunate like myself may hold in his heart. You, sir, should not look down upon me from your lofty pedestal, for you do not know me, and you would do well to look beyond appearances, for you too are a man of God. Faced by my irritation and my back, the Irishman tapped me carefully on the shoulder and persisted, Has anyone ever told you about the archive of confessions? No, of course not. And he continued in an even lower tone, confident of having spiked my interest. It is one of the greatest and most well-concealed secrets of the Christian world. I presume that you know what the sacrament of confession is, even though you do not practice it. Indeed, I knew of it and abominated this practice of arbitration, like all my fellow Protestant congregants. But I also knew how useful it was to the Church of Rome, insofar as it kept the faithful tied to the priest, and him at the very heart of their soul's darkest secrets. Apostolic guidance established individually in the shadow of the confession box would prove more efficient than the open sobriety of our collective ceremonies. I nodded, which seemed to encourage him, for he detected some sign of acquiescence in me. Come and sit over there, at that table, my good sir, he said, pointing to a particularly dark corner of that filthy hostelry. Buy this humble servant of yours a glass of that blessed brandy, and he'll tell you a singular story, worthy of your attention. What do you say, old chap? And old chap is in the original Portuguese. I don't know, old chap is very kind of English, public school. I think he was being ironic at that point. He was, yeah.
I even like it more. No, you cannot imagine my pleasure to be translated this way and to be read in this way, and my words like this, as they should be, read. It's. Thank you very much, David. Really.
Can I?
Yes.
I think it's a good time to perhaps invite questions from the audience and comments. And would anybody like to ask? Ilya, would you have anything to add, or anybody want to ask us anything at all? Or would you like to add anything, David? Carlos? So.
Thank you very much for two beautiful versions of an interesting book, I can see. I'm green of envy for not being able to write like that. Now, concerning Camões and our myth and sanctuary, so-called, in Camões Garden, I recall that in the old days, we were talking about love and the situation of Camões, the meat. And I recall that in the old days, it was very touching to see all these children of Macau going up to the grotto, the Camões grotto, and giving a rose, a flower to Camões. And we had kind of a pilgrimage of the whole children of Macau showing their love for our poet. Now this is one. The other one is around nearby. You have these poems in stone with Camões versions in Portuguese and the Chinese translations next to us, which is, I recommend, a pilgrimage for all Macau residents to get back into the myth of Camões.
I would like to say something else, is that just close to the garden of Camões, there is, for the Anglo-Saxon people, especially Protestants that live in Macau, I really recommend the Protestant Cemetery, which is one of the most beautiful places in Macau, just beside the Camões Garden. So, and one more reason to go there. Believe me, it's really my favorite place in Macau, this Protestant cemetery that was made because the people in Canton in the 19th century could not be buried there. I mean, the foreigners could not be buried there. It was not, there were no Christian land and to be buried, and the Chinese would not let them bury there because they understand that if they bury there, they have right to the land because there are some people buried there. So they sent them back to Macau. It was the only place where, until the existence of Hong Kong. So it's a very interesting place, and I recommend everybody to go to both places.
So, I want to go back to Argentina in a moment, but the ceremony of the flowers, when did that stop? 99 or?
It's still,
all right, it goes on.
Still goes on.
Isabel?
Thank you very much. After this great achievement, I would like to know, are there any plans for a translation in Chinese? Thank you.
It's not in my hands, but I would also like it translated in Hungarian and Japanese and Finnish and Russian and you know. But now that it's translated in English, what I feel that this is a big step for the world knowledge of this book, because as you know, English is today lingua franca, so what is not in English in a way doesn't exist. So after today, this book exists for more 7 billion people or more than existed before. Unfortunately, Portuguese is only spoken by 250 million. So, okay, now I have a much larger public to influence, and that's Chinese. I don't know. I don't control that.
Ilya.
Two things. One on translation. I'm just taking the clue from Glenn, and it's just when I heard Carlos say at the end, you know, how he enjoyed listening to his own text written in English, and I remember Landeg telling me that he always used to say to me, you know, yes, now it's in Portuguese, it sounds so much better. So this is it's an interesting comment about how translation works. Sometimes it sounds better in the translated language than in the original, at least to whoever is directly involved. Well, on the Camões issue, I don't have perhaps very much to say, except that just a few days ago I happened to be talking about this, as Glenn knows, at the university, and there is this another myth which is connected to this one, which is, of course, you mentioned the Dinamen myth. In some versions, this Dinamen is a name of a sea nymph in the Western tradition, is supposed to apply to a Chinese woman who was supposed to be Camões's lover. I don't know how many people know about this, but this myth has gone on for quite a while, and it has some interesting things connected with it, because again, a bit like the Macau thing, or perhaps even more than that, there are 16th century documents that make the connection between Dinamen and her being Chinese. So that there's perhaps something something there.
Read the book.
Okay.
Yeah, she's in the book too.
I'm very curious.
I give another solution to her problem too.
Oh, really?
You know, instead of dying in the shipwreck, like Camões, she also saved herself only on the other direction. Only she was going to the sea, was going to the shore, and Dinamen was pushed away, and something happened to her. You can see on the book.
Okay.
I'm not trying to tell.
Já agora deixe-me dar-lhe os parabéns em português. Gostei muito da apresentação e gostei muito do despretensiosismo da apresentação.
Obrigado.
Fiquei cheio de vontade de ler o livro.
Ótimo. Em português já agora? Em português?
Sim,
já
claro.
Okay.
apesar de tudo no original.
Before we finish, one of the things which is really, I thought, brilliant about the book is that Carlos manages to distill within the book. The main narrator, or the main character, this personification of evil, is a seafarer. I mean, he goes from Lisbon ultimately to Macau, and he has all these adventures along the way. And Carlos manages to refer to an enormous number of major works of literature along the way. So you from the Odyssey to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner to Heart of Darkness. So one of the great things of the novel, just it's this wonderful test. You actually find yourself trying to identify the different allusions. It becomes a literary quiz in a way. I presume that was deliberate on your part.
It was because, you know, I have this immense. It was like it was for pleasure, and it was also for pleasure of the readers that would understand it. I use a lot of different and references, literary reference. For instance, we have this joke. My Cape Verdean friends will excuse me. We used to say that the beginning of literature in Cape Verde was when Baudelaire passed by, and this albatross came to the boat, and so Baudelaire writes a poem about an albatross landing in a boat, and finally his wings are so big that he cannot come up again, and he's killed by the men that don't understand. He just wants to fly, and so he compares this to the poet. Okay, I use this. This is a sonnet by Baudelaire. We have this joke that when his trip to Africa, Baudelaire stopped in Cabo Verde. He didn't come out, but it was on the boat. So I make my character do more or less the same thing. He doesn't come out because he's not interested in food and brothels. And so he doesn't come out when he arrives to Cabo Verde. He stays on the boat. And I describe this episode of bird, an albatross that comes to the boat, and finally he compares himself to the bird because he also thinks himself so big that men don't understand him. So this is one of the literary references he was talking about, Glenn was talking about, and other things come from my studies in anthropology, namely the reference to the Trobriand Islands and Bronislaw Malinowski, and movies and others. There are many things. I make this joke like a glint of an eye to the reader that, you see, I'm referring to this. Can you make a smile with me? Can you smile with me a little bit? Because you see, I'm making because this is what I think it's literature, finally. I think the difference between writing and literature is that writing doesn't have to be reference to nothing. And literature is always a reference to a corpus of texts, to other authors. Literature is like a big text that is being written since the beginning, and it's self-referenced. It must be self-referenced. Literature cannot forget what was written last century. We are not going to repeat it again. So when we are written literature, or we are presumably written literature, there is these references, in my opinion. When it's just writing, like what I call airport writing, it's just stories, it's just writing, it's just the repetition of things. Yeah.
So really, it's the novel. It's a powerful novel. It's a literary challenge, and it's an amazing story. 150 mop behind you. Don't hesitate. Thank you.
Okay, muito obrigado. Thank you very much.